this little guy is called the active progress spiral. And so these two diagrams that I'm going to show you, so it's the active progress spiral and the active resistance loop. And these are the two diagrams that I've based my course off of. So the course is called Unraveling Resistance, Break the Trauma Loop, which you've seen, seen you on the list. Yeah. And these are the basis for essentially the entire course. And the course itself, I'm going to go into every single one of these phases and like split it down or break it down even more. And also give people like techniques for how to regulate through each of these phases, follow a workbook to try to, make sure they're figuring out how to apply it to their own unique challenge. So we'll talk about what this means in just a second here. But also a lot of this is meant to get people to recognize that this process is very innate. It's something that's actually within us. So this diagram is a combination of probably like 6 different disciplines. And the big ones are, of course, psychology and neuroscience, and they tend to not talk to each other. And so I decided, well, hey, let's mix it all together and see if I can create a visual for a process that I've noticed in my patients, like in terms of what they're doing as they're healing from trauma, or what people are doing as they're healing with something difficult, right? And this is actually a very, very normal process. So we're going to start with the first axis here. So the active progress spiral has 2 axes. It has the y-axis and then the helical axis. And the y-axis essentially shows how we can get from something that's like red hot. So a challenge is defined as something that creates either pain or fear or both, right? And it can include something very overwhelming, such as a traumatic event. But this can essentially be anything. And this challenge, when it's acute or recent or just like overwhelming, so really red hot, right, can be really intense here, but we can get to the point where eventually whatever this challenge is, maybe isn't as big of a deal, right? Doesn't hurt as much, or you're getting better at it, right? And then eventually you can get to the point where maybe the challenge doesn't necessarily go away, because we can't avoid all challenges, but you'll get to the point where you can move through it. So a very simple example can be like public speaking. Everyone's terrified of public speaking. In fact, I think it's like the number 2 fear next to death, the fear of public speaking, right? So at first that can be like terrifying. I don't want to speak in front of a whole bunch of people out in public, right? And eventually you'll get to the point, like if you had to, for whatever reason, to practice, or you really wanted to, you can get to the point where you get anxious before the speech, but you nailed it, you got it done. And maybe eventually, you don't stutter anymore. You know what you need to say. You don't necessarily need to prepare. Maybe you still get anxious, right? Because speaking in a new place or in public places might still cause a bit of anxiety, a bit of the jitters, but eventually you can get to the point where, oh, this isn't a big deal. I've learned how to deal or move through this challenge with ease. And so as we're going on the spiral, one thing to keep in mind is that this is the ideal, and it doesn't just look like one turn. Sometimes this takes many turns, just like, sometimes it'll take like, going to many venues or practicing different types of speeches before you get to the point where you're at a position of ease. So the helical axis is actually showing how an individual, or us as a little human body, kind of shifts through something that is scary, and we get to the point where we can start figuring out, okay, how do we move forward, right? And one of the things that happens right away, so this purple phase here is considered kind of more like body wisdom. So these 2 phases are essentially happening in like the instinctual, like physical nervous system. So if we take an example here real quick, so let's work with a challenge of, we could take a work example, being yelled at by your boss, right? In general, that's stressful, right? So if someone comes out of nowhere and yells at you, this of course will feel like some sort of hurt, like, oh, I wasn't expecting that. I'm hurt that this person yelled at me or was mean, right? Or scared, like, oh my gosh, like, why did that happen in the first place? And the very first thing that's going to happen, whether you like it or not, is you're going to go into some sort of coping or survival strategy, right? Because if this were a saber-toothed tiger, it doesn't matter what it is, your body's going to respond the same way. This was a threat. This was an ouchie. This was scary. I'm going to freak out for a little bit. And that's normal. And we'll see in the active resistance loop that this is basically where people start to trip up. So if we're not able to acknowledge, like, hey, that's scary and that sucks, let's go somewhere where we can decompress, right? And I'll show you real quick. We'll end up on the loop where essentially we actually start to deflect, and we'll end up going in a circle instead of a spiral. We'll focus on the spiral for right now. But these two places, this place right here is the most important part of making sure the spiral stays on track or continues its momentum. So, we get freaked out and we can do something such as, going home or taking a walk, whatever it is, and getting to a place where we can start to decompress. And decompression essentially requires acknowledgement. Right? It requires being able to be like, yeah, if someone yells at you in general, that's stressful, right? That sucks. That hurts. And if you're able to do that, then that means we can start paying attention to what we need to regulate, right? So if we realize, yeah, I'm scared, sometimes people, the first thing they'll notice is, oh man, my heart's racing really fast. Or maybe I'm shaky a little bit and like I can see my hands shaking, or maybe I just like feel all tense and closed in, right? And if we're able to recognize that, then that means, oh, we know how to regulate this, or we can figure out how to regulate it, right? If I'm super, super tense, maybe I go for a warm bath. If I'm like really, really jittery, like maybe I go for a walk, because that means there's a lot of energy here and I need to move it. I need to move through it, right? Whatever I need to do to regulate. Maybe meditation works for me, and maybe that's what I do right now, or whatever technique works for me. And basically we need to be willing to be very aware of the fact that, we need to pay attention to ourselves now. We need to take the moment to like calm down and figure out what happened and just chillax. And most of us, like I said, this is where most people tend to, trip up, because most people are going to think, oh, I shouldn't be affected by the fact that my boss yelled at me, right? Or I'm weak somehow if I got upset that my boss yelled at me, or, maybe they just suck and everybody just sucks, right? And we don't want to pay attention to what's going on here. And the thing is, like I said, this is super important, because once the nervous system essentially kind of, finds equilibrium again, so regains equilibrium, we're going to go into this next blue section here. And I color coded it for blue mostly for like higher cognition. So this is actually a very brain heavy phase. So this is what the brain is going to start doing once it moves far away enough from a challenge, whether that means time, right? A year has passed since the incident and now I can look back at it. Now I'm ready to do that. Or maybe I literally went home and I'm no longer in my workplace where I got yelled at, so I feel a little safer and now I can start looking back. And the thing is, so when we are super stressed out and in survival mode, one of the cool things that's really awesome if we want to get away from a saber-toothed tiger, but not as awesome when it comes to social structures, is that the blood flow in our brain literally switches, right? So when we freak out, all the blood flow in the brain starts to move away from the periphery, where we have the prefrontal cortex and we have the associative cortexes, and it goes down into the midline of the brain. And so the midline of the brain has the limbic system. So we don't care about meta thinking when we're freaked out. We care about GTFOing, right? Let's get out of this situation, or let's fight it, or let's play dead because the world's over. We can't deal with this, right? It's too much. And so if we're doing that, right, that literally means that we're not feeding the periphery, which literally means that it doesn't work very well, right? And we need to get to the point where we can change the blood flow. And the only way we can do that is by regulation. So this happens very effectively if we're calm. If we're calm and chill, if we manage to figure out, how to regulate ourselves and we paid attention to ourselves, we can enter this with a lot more ease, because this section is also a little bit scary if people don't know what's happening. So let's just say, for this example, as I go into this, that this particular challenge was particularly painful and scary, of the boss yelling at you, because let's just say you had a childhood where maybe one of your parents was really yelly and like verbally aggressive, right? So having that made it an extra ouchie, right? So when we enter here, what the brain's going to start trying to do is it's going to start figuring out first in regain equilibrium, are we safe, right? Are we actually safe? And so you're going to get some little echoes, which means like all of a sudden you'll get a little spike of anxiety out of nowhere. And the whole point of that is for you to literally look around and be like, am I near a saber-toothed tiger? Am I actually in my house? Yes, I am in my house. I am in a safe space, right? Am I still at work? No, I'm right here, right? And there's a point to that, right? We're making sure that we're safe because this next stage right here, it's really important that we are safe, because most people, when we go into deep thought, we are kind of lost to the world, right? So it's, once again, instinctually, it's important that we're fairly safe here. But if we resist this can be kind of scary, right? Because once again, people can have a lot of resistance here. Like, oh no, why am I still anxious out of nowhere? Like I should be over it by now, right? Or why am I suddenly thinking about what just happened? Like I'm at home, I should leave that stuff at work, right? Like get out of here, get out of my house. But this is important, right? And it's important to acknowledge it because we're about to enter a really awesome stage where ideally, like I said, after enough time or enough distance has happened, we're getting to the point where we feel safe enough to look at the challenge. And ideally, we're kind of looking at it from a bird's eye point of view. So we're looking right at the challenge. And the thing that the brain's going to try to do is it's going to try to take it apart. So we, in general, when something's really, really scary, we tend to smash everything together. And it's hard for us to tell the difference between the past, the present, and then what we're idealizing, right? But here is one of the times where we get to really be in what has actually happened. And what we need to do is be able to see, okay, so this challenge was scary, but what's different about it? So what's the change? So once again, if we go back to this idea that, this one was particularly scary because my parents were mean to me once upon a time when I was young and always yelled. So what's different? Oh, my boss is not my dad. Right? Or, oh, this time I'm an adult, right? And back then I was a child, which is why it was so scary then. And in this particular case, I can do something about it because it's different, right? And we need to be willing to do that. And then the next piece here is looking at what we're resisting. And maybe this was so intense because I didn't speak up because of the fact that I was trying to put my boss in this category of, oh, once someone's yells, they're the abuser, right? They're the terrible people. They're over there. They're just like my father or just like my mom, right? They're just like everybody else. And we need to be able to take accountability of what we're resisting, right? Which can be really hard, once again, if the challenge is overly painful. But we want to be able to sit with it and be like, okay, maybe this was a one-off and my boss is not just like everybody else just because of this one-off, right? So for this example, let's just say that this was a one-off, because it could have not been, but then the resistance is, oh, maybe I just like keep attracting these people not saying no, and that's the problem. Right? But for this example, let's just say it was a one-off, right? So I'm like, okay, I'm very resistant towards the fact of like, maybe I can do something about this, or maybe I just need to have a conversation. So maybe that's something that I need to accept, right? So looking at what I was accepting during this challenge and what I need to accept now. So maybe I was accepting someone just kind of walking all over me because A, maybe I was surprised and because it was a one-off, and B, maybe I've done this before in different types of challenges where I just kind of let people walk all over me. So I'm just kind of accepting this behavior, and this time I don't want to. Right? This time I want to do something different. So ideally, if we're going in the spiral, that's what we're thinking about. I want to do something different. And we are going to start orienting ideally towards safety. So we're trying to figure out, okay, so what's going to make this easiest for me, right? So maybe when I go talk to my boss, maybe I talk to HR first and have a third party in there with me. Or maybe after I talk to my boss, I go hang out with my friends at my favorite bar or my favorite pizza place, whatever it is, right? How can I kind of give myself a sense of safety? Or maybe, I go in there, I write down a little mantra for myself, I put it in my pocket and I go in there because it'll help me feel more confident, right? What's going to help me out with this? So ideally in this stage, we're basically just gleaning a whole bunch of little gems of insight, right? And this is going to create a very awesome next phase that can also be kind of scary if we don't understand what's happening. So once we do this, right, once we get all these gems, the brain's going to be like, okay, we need to apply these, right? So we're going to go into this next phase called the flow of past memories. And in the flow of past memories, essentially what's happening is the brain's looking at, its filing cabinet, and it pulls out the file of every single time you've ever felt the way you did during this challenge ever. So let's just say what created pain and fear maybe was this feeling of feeling small or feeling vulnerable, right? And the brain is not linear, it is associative. So it's going to pull out every single time in your life that you've ever felt vulnerable. And all of a sudden, you're going to be thinking about the cringy moment in like third grade where the teacher yelled at you. And you're going to be like, why am I thinking about this? Right. But the reason why this is happening is because the brain's taking out this file, taking this little gold gem and being like, haha, can I solve this problem now? And ideally we can be like, oh, you know what? During that time when I was like in third grade and the teacher yelled at me, that was their problem, right? I was a child. They were actually responsible for handling that better. So it's like, boom, I figured this out. This is resolved. We can put it back into the memory banks, right? We brought in this gem. And then all of a sudden I'm thinking about that cringy moment where my, ex-partner walked out on me in college. And I'm like, oh no, like, why am I thinking about this? I thought I was over it, blah, blah. But once again, it's the same thing. Brain's trying to figure out, okay, our little gems, how does it apply here, right? Because this is similar. I felt vulnerable here. And maybe it's realizing, oh, this is where I got that little gem of I accepted people walking all over me. And actually that person leaving made it so I dodged a bullet. And this guy actually had a whole bunch of stuff that I didn't actually like, right? So boom, I figured something out, right? This memory has been resolved. We can put it back in the memory banks. It goes back in there. And so this is a very powerful and awesome place. But a lot of people tend to have a lot of fear around it, right? Or a lot of resistance, like, no, I don't want to look at these things. But it's normal, it's natural. Brain's trying to apply what we just figured out. And because once we do this is going to give us enough momentum to go into the next phase here, which is the green phase. And this green phase, we could say, is more action oriented, or an integrative phase. So the brain can sit here and we can pontificate about all of the possible solutions in the world, but unless we take action in the real world, you're not going to solve the problem, right? You have to create or engage a new pattern in some way. And so that's what the brain's going to start doing. We're going to start a process of re-engagement. So ideally, we're redirecting. We're trying to figure out, okay, if I let people walk all over me, then that means I need to start saying no more. So let's try to say no more. And what the brain's going to do is it's actually going to recreate situations, which is really, really cool. Ideally, this isn't like necessarily a negative thing. What it's trying to do is create a pattern practice. So if you've decided, hey, I'm going to start saying no more, you might notice that in small ways, all of a sudden you start saying no to your cat. So your cat used to jump all over your keyboard and you just couldn't say no to them. But now you're starting to be able to put a little bit more boundary and say no to your cat, right? And that's because the brain's trying to practice this pattern, because we're about to hit a biggie, right? And it helps to be able to practice the pattern before we go into our boss's office and have a conversation about being yelled at, right? So ideally, we are practicing the pattern. So then when we get into this next phase where we are intentionally trying to act on this, right? Because we're going to go right back in. And ideally, we have more awareness of the strategy we're moving with, right? Because this might happen anyway, and I'll show it to you on the next one. But in order for it to go better, or for us to get to this next stage over here in perspective, we need to be aware that we're essentially testing something, right? We want to be a little bit more in tune with the outcome that we're looking for, right? And so ideally, we're aware, we're like, okay, getting ready to say no or to speak up to myself. And so we go into our boss's office and we talk about it, right? And then you realize, oh, that wasn't so bad. So you're able to kind of go through it, right? You're able to implement what you wanted to implement. Maybe you have a good conversation about like, hey, the time that you yelled at me in front of the colleagues the other day, like that actually was kind of hurtful for me. Like that actually was kind of scary. Like, I want to talk about, was this a one-off? Like, I don't think I should be treated this way, right? And the person, maybe it was a one-off, and they're like, oh, hey, I realized that I was out of line. And we had this great conversation. And even though it was anxiety inducing and I was kind of scared in the moment, actually wasn't that bad, right? It was a little less intense this time. Or maybe, if we went back and realized that that was not a one-off and this person was just like that all the time, then maybe we're finally, what, bye. I don't want to accept this behavior, from my boss anymore. So I'm leaving, or I'm choosing a different place to be, right? And once again, that might be really intense and kind of scary, but if it's, something that is going to allow you to grow or move forward in some way, you'll realize that, oh, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't as bad as I thought, right? And ideally, like I said, we're going to go around again. And this, maybe having hard conversations is the skill that we're learning. It's going to get easier and easier and easier, right? Or eventually maybe the skill is, learning to depersonalize from, someone else's like negative behavior, right? Not taking it as personally. If someone is yelling, right? Because there's always going to be a yeller somewhere nearby, right? But I don't have to take it personally. I don't have to say, oh, they're yelling because I did something wrong. And that's also a skill, learning when to see, oh, did I actually, push somebody, or are they just yelling because they're just angry, right? And that's not necessarily my fault. Eventually we can get to the point where that doesn't bother us as much anymore, right? And so once we get here in the perspective phase, what we're trying to do to essentially keep this momentum going so we can get up to the green spot over here is we want to start reflecting on what happened in the past and what was successful about that, right? So when my boss yelled at me, the first thing I did, even though I wasn't able to speak up, was go for a walk. And you know what? Actually, that was effective. That helped me out because I was able to realize, oh, you know what? I'm stressed out, right? And I was able to realize too that going for a walk actually helped me calm down, lower my heart rate. I didn't feel as shaky, right? And then it helped me pay attention more to myself. So that was a success. So next time, something like that happens and I don't know what to do, first thing I'm going to try to do is go for a walk, right? And we're going to try to hopefully reorient towards solutions, right? And this doesn't mean like the capitalist productivity definition, like this means solutions for yourself. Like, how do I, get to the point where I can solve this or regulate this or understand what this means or understand this part without it derailing me or making me freak out, right? So this is the active progress spiral. So this is the positive part. And this is the one that I actually like fully break down to try to guide someone into helping them figure out how to solve their own challenge. All right, so I like focusing on the positive first, and that's also one of the things that I do in the course. So we'll actually see the active progress spiral first and work on it before we go to the next one. Mostly because one of the ideas that I have behind this is that I think sometimes we focus too hard on what went wrong, right, on the negative, and you're about to see why that doesn't help. Because if we're focused too much on the negative, like it makes this feel kind of impossible. Like if I can't envision what it looks like to have an easier time giving a speech, right, I'm never going to get there. And that's essentially kind of like, if we're talking about the brain, the prefrontal cortex essentially works like that. If we give it a little shiny of this is what I want, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for coordinating the rest of the brain and the nervous system to do it, right? And this works in short term. So if I decide I'm thirsty, the rest of the brain is going to be like, all right, let's look for water, right? And let's get the thing so we can solve the solution or solve this problem with the solution of water, and the problem being I'm thirsty. And we can do that, in small ways, but we can also do that in huge ways too. But the caveat is we need to have a focal point, right? Which is like why I named my approach focal neurocognitive and physio-emotional integration. We need to have something that tells us this is what we're aiming for. Because if we don't, so now we're going to look at the next one. So this is the active resistance loop, which can also be known as the trauma loop. And so we go into this if one, if this is a trauma, if this pain or fear or this challenge is like way too overwhelming and confusing and disorienting, then we're going to have a really hard time, figuring out what we need to do next, or even what just happened, right? Or to understand or calibrate basically what is going on here. This can also happen, which is why the name is active resistance loop, when we have a lot of resistance towards going through these natural phases. So these phases are going to happen whether or not you want them to, and they can be, very productive and helpful, like we saw in the spiral, or they can keep you stuck in a very terrible loop forever. And the definition of trauma in a nutshell essentially is the nervous system caught in a loop, right? As if the past is happening over and over and over and over again, right? And so this is what essentially I'm trying to teach people how to break out of. And you may have seen this in others before as we talk through it. And I essentially use this almost as like troubleshooting. So we've looked at the positive, and now we want to look at like the little red flags to watch out for. So essentially what happens here, so if the challenge, for whatever reason, right, our boss yelled at us, was too, almost like too intense, or was too similar to an original problem, right? So the very terrible childhood, if this person, I don't know, you happen to have the same name as one of your parents, or, it was extremely humiliating and it lasted for a really long time, whatever it was, that'll be really intense. And what's going to happen is you're going to go into this coping or survival strategy, right? And like I said here, this is where we first trip up, right? If we can't handle this feeling, right? Or we believe that we shouldn't be feeling this feeling, right? Like I should get over it, like nothing actually happened, blah, blah, blah. We're stuffing it all down. We're going to go into a deflection mode. And this is essentially a type of self-neglect. So we're not going to be able to regulate. We're actually going to avoid it, mostly because we're trying not to feel it, which means we're being resistant towards being in the now, being in the present, paying attention to ourselves, because either the emotions or the physical sensations are just like way too much. I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to feel this. So I'm just going to press it down. I'm going to try to push it away. And unfortunately, once we start going into the cognitive area of this cycle, if we are stressed out, right, this never turns green. This essentially stays in yellow. If we're super stressed out and freaked out, and we enter the part where the brain's trying to figure out, hey, are we safe or not? Can we start breaking this down? Instead of having just those little echoes, right, which can be intense too, like the sudden spikes of anxiety, we're going to get really intense versions of those. And this essentially can become flashbacks. So when we're looking at chronic trauma, the flashback is an emotional flashback. So we'll go right back into feeling the way we used to feel when we were caught in that time or when that trauma was happening. Or we will get really fixated on the fact that, our boss yelled at us and they suck, and we'll just like won't be able to let it go. It's just really intense. So the intrusive or obsessive cognitions, and then we're going to kick in some pretty intense avoidance mechanisms. And essentially what this is for is there's a little piece of your brain right here who truly believes that if you, look at this or try to engage this or really feel what's happening for you, you're going to somehow get, transported back in time to the original place. Or if this was the original problem, right back into yesterday or the day that you got yelled at, right? So we start to try to avoid all of this because we're afraid of going back. And what happens here is that'll make this next stage really, really hard and pretty intense, right? Because when we start to, once again, look back at the challenge, so we're no longer kind of taking that bird's eye view, we're kind of looking straight across, so we can't really see what's going on as much. And we're going to hyper focus on the negative evidence. And we're going to start reinforcing the narrative of a negative outcome, such as, you know what? I'm just a person that everybody's always going to yell at. Everybody sucks. There's only two types of people in the world, the abusers and the victims. And we're going to get real stuck on like everything sucks and nothing's ever going to turn out well. We're going to obviously from that not self-reflect. We're going to also not be able to do non-reactive observation. So we may be able to see what went wrong, but we'll tie a lot of negativity or emotionality to those like little gems, basically. And what happens then is we're going to start resisting against accountability. And this can make sense, right? So if this were, the original challenge of childhood, the having accountability basically is being able to see that, oh, I was a child and I didn't actually have much control there. And that's hard. That sucks. That's hard to do, right? And also recognizing that that means that as an adult, I can do something different. And if you're not ready to go there, you're going to majorly not want to look at that. Right? Like I have no control, like everyone just is going to treat me terrible forever. Like, no, I don't want to take accountability in this way, right? Because it sucks. It still hurts a lot. And unfortunately, if you do that, that's going to reinforce a feeling of lack of safety. Like I'm never going to be safe. Like, work environments are always going to be volatile. Public speaking is always going to be terrible. Everyone's always going to boo me, right? I'm never going to have this safety. And what will guarantee, once you do that, what will essentially guarantee that you're going to end up in a loop for a while is if you start to identify with the pain or the fear or the event or the outcome or the trigger or the coping mechanism. So basically what this means is saying, well, I'm just a person that will always be sad forever and scared and no one will ever treat me well, right? Or I'm always going to be someone that gets yelled at all the time and people always walk all over me and that's just how life is. Or everything always turns out bad for me and that's just how the world works, right? The moment you do that, you're going to guarantee that you're going to end up in a loop, right? Because you've essentially made this loop your identity, right? And so once you start moving into here, this is going to be kind of intense too. And this can basically explain some pretty extreme behavior. So the next phase, when we're trying to look at all of those memories, because the brain's still going to be like, oh, look at all these bad, ugly gems. We're going to try to apply them into all our terrible past memories. So it's still going to do the same exact thing, but this time it's going to be more intense. And we're going to start really rubbing up against the fear of impermanence. So we're still kind of aware that when this happens, that means that we're kind of far away enough from the challenge, right? We're not there. Like this is actually kind of a good state. And we're starting to realize, oh no, this is going to go away, right? Eventually we're going to have to go back to work, or we're going to have to, deal with the parent again, or deal with something, or someone somewhere is going to yell. And eventually this is just going to happen again. We're kind of aware that this is going to happen again. And so this is going to create a lot of resistance. So we're not going to want to look at any of our past memories because we're like, oh no, this means that, this like temporary no man's land is going to go away. Everything's going to get terrible again. And so we're going to see a lot of impulsion or compulsions here. We can even see mania or psychosis where it's like, oh man, since everything's going to go to shit anyway, let's take all the drugs and drink all the drinks right now, right? Eat all the food. This can be overindulgence. This can also be over restriction too, and overexertion, right? So we're just going to try to do all the things right now before everything magically goes away. And once we do this, we're going to be, pretty exhausted when we get into this next phase. So once again, whether you like it or not, we're going to try to practice the pattern, right? And unfortunately, if we weren't able to feel calm and like really go for these positive gems that are going to help us figure out a solution, we're going to essentially reenact. So in some way, we're going to end up starting to attract the same problem to us. And this is normal. The brain's trying to figure out the solution, right? And if we haven't figured out or pulled out the right gems or some of the positive gems, then we're just going to do the same exact thing, right? We're going to act in the same exact way. There's going to be a lot of reactivity here and resistance. We're going to start engaging binary pattern thinking. So essentially what that means is kind of like I said before, like there's only two people in the world, the victims and the abusers, right? The lions and the sheep. We're going to start thinking only in binaries. It's either all or nothing. And what we're creating for ourselves during this re-engagement phase is we're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. So then when we go into here, when we're getting ready to implement our strategy, so once again, this right here doesn't necessarily mean it makes you dumb, right? You can still have pretty high intelligence here, and you still might be able to see what went wrong. But if you're too stressed out or grabbing onto the negative, you're not going to be able to apply the strategy very well, right? There's going to be a lot of reactive subconscious patterning here. So then when I go right back into the challenge, either maybe I started out well, but because someone said something slightly off, I go right back into defense mode, or I freak out, or everything, you know, I'm not able to stand up for myself and they walk all over me again, and everything's just going to fall apart, and I'm going to rewound. I'm just going to cause more pain and fear, and unfortunately give myself more negative evidence of the fact that no matter what I do, everything goes to shit, right? And so this right here, this is the trauma loop, or the active resistance loop.